Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. We love to tackle those thought-provoking topics, and today is no exception. We're diving into a subject that often sparks a lot of debate, especially within Christian circles, and that's premarital sex.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation that can get, well, pretty heated sometimes.
Exactly. And, we received some really interesting sources from a listener that approached this topic from both a biblical perspective and a practical relationship standpoint.
That's great. Having those different viewpoints can really help us understand this complex issue better.
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. One of the sources actually suggests that the Bible might not explicitly forbid premarital sex.
Hmm, that's interesting. I can see how that might raise some eyebrows.
Right. Instead, it seems to focus more on the idea of sexual immorality in general, especially outside the context of marriage. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true that the term premarital sex doesn't actually appear in the Bible. The source highlights verses like 1 Corinthians 6.18-20.
Oh, right, where Paul talks about fleeing from sexual immorality.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because he frames it as a sin against your own body.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's not necessarily about the specific act of premarital sex itself, but more about the broader concept of sexual misconduct or immorality.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. And then you have verses like Hebrews 13.4, which talk about the sanctity of marriage.
Right, the marriage bed being undefiled and all that.
Exactly. It emphasizes the importance of sex within the context of marriage, but it doesn't directly condemn what happens outside of marriage.
That's a good point. So it seems like some interpretations might be more focused on upholding the sacredness of marriage as a whole, rather than specifically condemning premarital relationships.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to look at it. And it's important to remember that different denominations and theologians have varying viewpoints on how to interpret these passages.
Okay, that makes sense. This source also takes a pretty bold approach and actually lays out 13 arguments for premarital sex. And I'll be honest, I was kind of surprised by some of them.
Oh, I can imagine. I'm curious to hear more about those.
Yeah, me too. So do you think these arguments, even within a Christian framework, hold any weight?
Well, it's important to remember that the source isn't necessarily advocating for disregarding biblical teachings altogether. It's more about encouraging a more holistic understanding of the complexities involved.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
Right. For example, some of the arguments focus on the idea of establishing sexual identity and developing sexual experience.
Yeah, those stood out to me too. But how do those ideas connect to a discussion about premarital sex, especially within a religious context?
Well, think about it this way. Exploring those aspects of yourself, before entering a lifelong commitment like marriage, could actually lead to greater self-awareness and confidence.
That's an interesting perspective.
Right. And those qualities, that self-awareness and confidence, could ultimately benefit the long-term relationship down the line.
So it's like advocating for a period of self-discovery and personal growth as part of the journey.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But of course, the source also emphasizes the importance of approaching those experiences with maturity and responsibility.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the physical act itself, right?
Right, exactly. It's about understanding the emotional and psychological implications as well.
For sure. That seems like a bit of a tightrope walk, finding that balance.
Oh, it definitely can be. And that's why the source really stresses the importance of personal discernment, considering your own values and beliefs when making decisions about this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The source also brings up some pretty practical considerations like, assessing sexual compatibility and
Mhm.
figuring out if there are any potential issues, before marriage.
Yeah, those are definitely important things to think about.
Could you elaborate a bit more on those points?
Sure. I think those arguments approach the topic from a more pragmatic standpoint. It's like addressing these issues early on before making a lifelong commitment could actually prevent bigger problems down the road.
It's like getting all the cards on the table before you make that big decision, right?
Exactly. Think about it. Sexual compatibility. And that includes things like libido and preferences, that can really impact a relationship's happiness and health in the long run.
Yeah, you definitely wouldn't want to be surprised by those things later on.
Exactly. Identifying any potential issues early on gives couples a chance to address them openly and honestly. And that could potentially prevent conflicts or dissatisfaction down the line.
It's about making informed decisions rather than going into marriage with blinders on.
Precisely.
Makes a lot of sense. The source also brings up some interesting points about happiness and even health. It claims there's research linking premarital sex to greater relationship satisfaction and overall well-being. What do you think about that?
Well, there has been some research that shows a connection between sexual activity and positive outcomes, both emotionally and physically.
Right. Like, I know studies have shown that sexual activity can release endorphins, reduce stress, and even boost the immune system.
That's right. But it's important to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on those studies. They don't necessarily focus specifically on premarital sex, and they don't prove cause and effect.
Oh, right, right. There are a ton of factors that contribute to happiness and health in a relationship, like communication and shared values.
Exactly. So it's more about understanding that there might be a connection, but it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, that makes sense. Another argument that the source makes is about building trust through premarital sex. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting perspective. The argument suggests that because engaging in premarital sex involves a certain level of vulnerability, it could actually strengthen the bond within a relationship.
Right, it's about that shared experience and the intimacy that comes with it.
Yeah, exactly. When you share that kind of vulnerability with someone, it can definitely foster a deeper connection and trust. But it's also important to acknowledge that trust can be built in other ways too.
Oh, for sure. Like through open communication and shared experiences that don't necessarily involve sex.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Definitely not. It's about finding what works best for each couple and understanding that there are multiple paths to building trust.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why this whole topic is so complex. There are so many factors to consider, both from a practical standpoint and a religious one.
For sure.
Yeah.
You know, one argument that I found particularly interesting was the idea that premarital sex can actually help you understand your partner better.
Oh, yeah. That's a thought-provoking one.
What do you think about that?
Well, it's based on the idea that sexual intimacy can help facilitate a deeper emotional connection and understanding.
So it's not just about the physical act, right?
Right. It's about the vulnerability and the communication that can come along with it.
So almost like a catalyst for deeper emotional intimacy.
Yeah, exactly. By exploring each other physically, couples might gain a deeper understanding of their partner's needs, desires, and vulnerabilities.
It seems like that could lead to some really meaningful conversations and a stronger connection.
It definitely could. But you also have to consider whether that same level of intimacy can be achieved without actually engaging in premarital sex.
That's a really good point. There are other ways to build intimacy, like through sharing experiences and being emotionally vulnerable with each other.
Exactly. It's a question worth pondering, you know. Does premarital sex enhance that understanding, or are there other ways to get there? It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right. This has been such a thought-provoking discussion so far. It's clear that the topic of premarital sex within Christianity is way more nuanced than a lot of people might realize. We've already covered a lot of ground, but there are still some interesting arguments to explore from our listeners' sources.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to digging into those with you. So, one of the arguments that the source makes is kind of interesting. It suggests that engaging in premarital sex can actually reduce curiosity and potentially prevent those insecurities or doubts later on in the relationship.
I see what you mean. It kind of seems counterintuitive, but I could see how that might play out in some cases.
Yeah, the argument is that sometimes the unknown can actually create a sense of anxiety or uncertainty in a relationship,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to something as personal and as intimate as sex. So by addressing that curiosity beforehand, couples might be able to build a more solid foundation.
Yeah, so instead of letting those anxieties just linger in the background, it's about kind of facing them head on. Right?
Exactly. Being proactive and addressing those potential issues rather
Yeah.
than avoiding them.
I like that. Another argument that really stood out to me was this concept of shared experience. You know, the source talks about how premarital sexual experiences can create these unique memories and bonds that might enrich the relationship and even reinforce commitment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It speaks to the power of shared experiences in building intimacy and connection, right? When couples share those memories, especially the ones that involve a certain level of vulnerability and emotional intensity, it can really strengthen their bond.
Totally. It's almost like creating a shared history together, even before you officially tie the knot.
That's a great way to put it. Weaving a tapestry of shared experiences, deepening that connection, and creating a sense of unity.
And then the source brings up reduced stress as a potential benefit. It points to the fact that sexual activity can release endorphins and reduce those stress hormones, which, I mean, Makes sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. It aligns perfectly with all the research that's out there about sexual activity and stress reduction. When we engage in physical intimacy, it triggers that release of endorphins, and we all know those have those awesome mood boosting and pain relieving effects.
Right. So it's not just about the pleasure and that emotional connection, but also about those potential physical and mental health benefits too.
Yeah, exactly. It highlights how interconnected our physical, emotional, and mental states really are.
Totally. Okay, so then the source shifts gears a bit and starts exploring some arguments that might resonate more with people who prioritize practicality and communication. Like, for example, it suggests that premarital sex can lead to better communication of feelings.
Hmm. That's an interesting angle. The idea there is that engaging in sexual activity might encourage couples to be more open and communicative about their needs, desires, and feelings in general. It creates a space for vulnerability and emotional honesty.
So it's like breaking down those communication barriers
Mm.
and fostering a deeper level of intimacy.
Precisely. Creating a safe and comfortable space for that open dialogue and emotional expression.
Love it. Okay, last but not least, the source presents this argument of better intimacy with a partner, emphasizing that premarital sex can help couples assess their physical and emotional compatibility in this really important area of the relationship.
Right, and this argument acknowledges the significant role that sexual intimacy plays in a relationship. It suggests that exploring that aspect beforehand can really help couples understand if their needs and desires align.
It's about making sure that there's that genuine connection, both physically and emotionally.
Exactly. Recognizing that sexual intimacy is a multifaceted aspect of a relationship that should be approached thoughtfully and carefully.
It's so important to point out that the source isn't presenting these 13 arguments as like absolute truth or endorsements,
Well,
right?
for sure, the source is not advocating for any specific choice. It's more about presenting a range of perspectives and encouraging thoughtful reflection.
It's about empowering people to make informed decisions based on their own values, beliefs, and relationship dynamics.
Exactly. And it's about having open and honest conversations about these complex issues without judgment or shame.
So, having looked at both the biblical interpretations and these practical arguments, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive so far?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the Bible's stance on premarital sex might be a lot more nuanced than how it's often portrayed. The Bible clearly emphasizes the sanctity of marriage, but it doesn't necessarily offer a black and white condemnation of premarital sex.
Yeah, it's about understanding that different interpretations exist and approaching those interpretations with an open mind.
Another important point is that there are valid practical arguments both for and against premarital sex. Some emphasize personal growth and self-discovery, while others stress the importance of compatibility and communication in a relationship.
It's definitely a lot to think about. I think the key takeaway is to weigh those arguments carefully and make a choice that feels right for you and your values.
Couldn't agree more. There's no universal right or wrong answer here. What matters most is making a thoughtful decision, considering all the factors involved.
Right. Ultimately, it's about respecting individual choices and recognizing that there are many paths to building healthy and fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. That's a really important message to send.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, giving us all lots to ponder. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to consider as they continue exploring this complex topic.
Okay, shoot.
So, if the foundation of a relationship is built on love, respect, and commitment, how does premarital sex fit into that equation?
That's a powerful question. It really challenges us to examine how our actions and choices align with our core values.
It's about reflecting on our beliefs and figuring out how premarital sex fits into our personal understanding of what a loving and committed relationship truly means.
And engaging in those open and honest conversations with our partners, respecting each other's perspectives and expectations.
Right, because at the end of the day, this deep dive has provided tons of information and different perspectives, but the decision ultimately rests with each individual.
Absolutely. May you find clarity, wisdom, and peace as you navigate this deeply personal aspect of your life and relationships.
Wow, this has been such a fascinating conversation. We've explored so much biblical interpretations, practical considerations, personal reflections, and it seems like there just isn't a simple answer when it comes to premarital sex, especially within Christianity.
Yeah, definitely a multifaceted topic with a lot of different angles. I think one of the biggest takeaways, at least for me, is that there's a lot of room for nuance. It's not black and white. There's space for individuals to make their own choices.
Right. It's not about trying to force everyone into the same mold or blindly follow a set of rules.
Exactly. What feels right for one person or one couple might not be right for another. It comes down to personal values, beliefs, and, the unique dynamics of every relationship.
You know what really stood out to me during this conversation? It was the importance of honest and open communication, both with ourselves and with our partners.
Oh, absolutely. Communication is key. Whether someone decides to engage in premarital sex or chooses to abstain, the important thing is that they make that decision consciously and thoughtfully. And they need to be able to talk openly and honestly with their partner about it.
It's about creating a safe space built on trust and understanding, where both people feel comfortable sharing their feelings and perspectives without being judged.
Yes, exactly. That kind of open communication, it's essential for any healthy relationship, no matter what your views on premarital sex are.
This whole deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners out there. This topic really calls for a lot of self-reflection, doesn't it?
It does. It's a journey of personal exploration. And what matters most is figuring out what feels right and true for you, both as an individual and as a couple.
I love that. I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today. But in the end, the decision of whether or not to engage in premarital sex is a deeply personal one. There isn't a right or wrong answer. The important thing is to make a choice that aligns with your values, your beliefs, and the unique dynamics of your relationship.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. Our views and beliefs might change over time, and that's okay. The important thing is to approach this topic with an open mind, an open heart, and a willingness to have those honest, respectful conversations.
Well said. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the complex and sometimes challenging topic of premarital sex within the context of Christianity. We hope you found this conversation insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even spark some conversations of your own.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep those conversations going.